The following podcast is banned in the state of Florida for talking about a dangerous leftist book, the Bible. Like the Bible, this podcast contains frank discussions on sensitive topics, including sex, violence, and cursing. Please proceed with caution. It is better to rely on the Lord than to put any trust in rulers. All the ungodly encompass me. In the name of the Lord, I will repel them. This is the word in black and red. Hello, and welcome to the Word in Black and Red, where we read the Bible from a leftist and liberationist perspective to elucidate the way people of faith and their comrades can understand the Bible as a source of healing, love, and liberation for all people. I am your host, Micah Belong, the wise old Llama MB, joined today by the wonderful Derek White, W. Scott McCandless, and our dear friend Al, perpetual host with me, and I am so glad that all of these wonderful people are here with us today. Because we are now in a new season, this is our first episode in the book of Exodus, so I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to reintroduce yourselves. And so if you can tell me your political tendency, your religious background, and how we can connect with you.
My name is Derek White. You can connect with me online. Just Google The Geek Preacher and you can pretty much find me. But if you want to go to a website, you can go to patreon.com/The Geek Preacher. I'm known for doing documentaries on faith and imagination, most notably the Satanic Panic and the Battle for the Religious Imagination. My political tendencies are all across the board. Mainly, I lean toward Christian anarchy, but I'm also a distributionist in the sense of G.K. Chesterton. What that basically means is that everyone should have a home and a place to live, and that should be provided by whatever government or power is there, that people should have housing, their own home, and a place to grow their own sustainable food.
Scott McCandless. I am a Canadian, so that puts me in a different space. I am a Presbyterian minister with the Presbyterian Church in Canada, so I work with a church up here. I also have my own podcast, Retelling the Bible, on which I love to retell Bible stories and bring out the characters, the people who are often missed or forgotten, or tell the story from a different point of view. I love Bible stories. Politically, I fall on the left in Canada, maybe not to the extreme, but I know if I want to follow Jesus, it's going to lead me to some radical places. So
I am constantly recommending everyone go and listen to Retelling the Bible. As I listen through, I just often, I most often hit the share button and I just take it to the Discord. So highly recommend. And Elle.
Hi, I'm Elle. I'm a Christian anarchist, which means I'm basically a spiritual anarcho-communist. That's all that means. You can find me on the Discord.
Well, we have a wonderful story today. The story that we are about to tell begins the book of Exodus. It is a natural continuation of the end of the book of Genesis. There is at least one scholar who claims that this should be considered one book, not divided as they are in our modern Bibles, because it just continues on. It's just like, these are the names of the Israelites who came to Egypt, and it tells you exactly what it told you in the book of Genesis, and then it continues on as if you know all of that background and you know all of these other things. It is one of my favorite stories. It is a story that gets repeated in the New Testament in a really interesting way that we'll dive into a little bit with the help of Bart Ehrman. And the script is at least 7 pages long. So the other thing that I never mentioned on the show is that we typically read out of the Common English Bible. I highly recommend it as a translation. Every once in a while, you'll hear me read from the translation that is being done by our friends at Found in Translation, Brandon and Brandon. And sometimes you'll hear me interweave my own translation of the Hebrew or the Greek. I'm not very good at it, but I'd rely on experts who are a lot much better. But right now, you're going to be hearing the Common English Bible. Exodus 1, 2 through 10. These are the names of the Israelites who came to Egypt with Jacob, along with their households: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number in Jacob's family was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Eventually, Joseph, his brothers, and everyone in his generation died. But the Israelites were fertile and became populous. They multiplied and grew dramatically, filling the whole land. Now a new king came to power in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. He said to his people, "The Israelite people are now larger in number and stronger than we are. Come on, let's be smart and deal with them. Otherwise they will only grow in number. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from the land." As a result, the Egyptians put foremen of forced work gangs over the Israelites to harass them with hard work. They had to build storage cities named Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they grew and spread, so much so that the Egyptians started to look at the Israelites with disgust and dread. So the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. They made their lives miserable with hard labor, making mortar and bricks, doing field work, and by forcing them to do all kinds of other cruel work. The king of Egypt spoke to 2 Hebrew midwives named Shiprah and Puah. "When you are helping the Hebrew women give birth and you see the baby being born, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, you can let her live." So this story is an interesting one that has been understood in many different ways across time. We're going to go ahead and take it a little bit piece by piece and go through here, beginning here with this introduction into the people of Israel.
So this early section makes me feel like there's missing reasons as to really how did the Pharaoh force the Hebrews into slavery? How did Pharaoh force the Israelites into slavery? And I think the missing reason is really debt, because Pharaoh did, the most common way a person would become a slave back in the day is to be conquered. Well, the Israelites just moved there. They weren't conquered. The other very common way to become enslaved in the day was to sell your life because of your debt. Your debts catch up to you, essentially. And I think it's really this reason because debt is a central theme later in Exodus. In Exodus 21:2, a new rule is enacted regarding debt that at the end of your 6th year, if your debts hadn't been paid back and you are enslaved to pay your debts, you would become free on your 7th year. So I kind of see it as the debt of the Jewish people became a justification for the lifelong servitude without end, because it's not just the next generation when Moses is born. It's 400 years later, and if they're constantly having more children and everything, that's gonna come with a certain level of debt, which was common and normal throughout human history, the debts we owe each other to survive, normal. But Joseph enacting this heavy debt where the Egyptians sold their lives to the Pharaoh kind of gets it gets reflected back in the Israelites becoming slaves because of their debt later on. And it's all because of the system that Joseph imposed.
Yeah. Just in case anyone is wondering what we're talking about, we're talking, first off, go back and listen to our episode on Genesis 47.
It would be super weird if they started on this one.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Go back and listen to our episode on Genesis 47, and you will see there this argument that we make that I think is pretty rooted in the text, that Joseph causes the enslavement of all of Egypt. First he takes everyone's cattle, then he takes everyone's land, and when they have literally no property left, then he takes them on as slaves as well. And so, to me, what's happening here is that we are seeing the same sort of economic exploitation happening in Egypt that happened in the beginning of the United States, right? Where there was this allegiance based off of ethnicity between the Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and although the Pharaoh and the Egyptians have nothing in common, the Egyptians are slaves too, right, to Pharaoh. The Pharaoh tells the Egyptians, oh, you can be at least better than the Israelites because they're our enemy, right? Because the Pharaoh recognizes that if these two people team up, they can overthrow the Pharaoh, right? Now, the reasons given here are not too far off from that they'll join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from the land. But that is Pharaoh trying to build solidarity with his own class of Egyptians whereas the natural solidarity that should exist is between the Egyptians and the Hebrews, just like in the early United States, the natural solidarity that existed was between white indentured servants and enslaved Africans, and we invented this category of black to invent the lie of white supremacy, and the rich white people could say to the poor white people, we're on the same team against those, terrible Africans who will join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from the land.
I also think that, like, a more modern echo of this is how economically dependent we are on immigrants, particularly ones coming from South America.
Mm-hmm.
And these Egyptians here, like, Pharaoh reveals his fear that, like, they are so dependent on the Israelite economic productivity. He also fears them teaming up with people and leaving, where we have this fear, like, we are so economically dependent on immigrants. We fear them coming in, but we also, like, would absolutely fear them leaving. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. This is my future prediction. If Trump wins, maybe he'll force people into slavery. Just consider that.
Well, it's not like the country doesn't already do that with
Well,
forced labor and internment, but
What?
yeah, I see the point.
Prison and debt are both methods of enslavement to people.
Yeah.
Just look at Haiti,
Absolutely.
permanently indebted to France.
Yeah. For the slaves, right? Like, they're permanently indebted to France because France is making them pay for the freedom of the slaves that the French people stole after the French people stole all the natural resources from Haiti.
Well,
Anyway, sorry.
Well, France has this, like, sweet spot as a colonizer where they both charge people who liberate themselves from their colonial rule debt, and then they also charge people who didn't liberate themselves from their colonial rule debt, like in Madagascar,
Oh, goodness.
where, they charged for all the bridges and roads and all of the things that the Madagascar people didn't ask for to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good
That's-
job, France.
Debt is slavery. Woo, woo, woo.
Yep.
The thing that really strikes me, anyways, is how when we oppress people, there's a deep fear of the people in power begin to feel a deep fear of the people they are oppressing. Often because there's so many more of the oppressed than the oppressors, they are outnumbered, and there is a power in those people that very clearly the Pharaoh, the king, fears, and the upper class Egyptians fear. And the people we enslave become a threat to us. As it should be, but yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I want to note two things. First off, that it's really important to emphasize that the New Testament is written as fan fiction of the Old Testament, right? Like, and I don't use fan fiction as a derogatory term to say, like, that it's false or anything. Like, I am a Christian. I believe the Gospels talk about a God who became a human being and like, pretty orthodox in all of those things. But it's important to note that a lot of the things that happen in the New Testament are echoed in these stories. And we have started with these stories because they are the foundation of our understanding of the faith. So it's really important to note here that there are 12 sons of Jacob that go into Egypt, right? Just like Jesus has 12 disciples that he takes with him into his ministry. And then by the time they get there, there are 70 of them, just like the 70 that Jesus will send out to spread this message, right? And I think that Jesus' message, particularly in the book of Matthew, is meant to look like Jesus is the new Moses, because you will see this story of Moses' birth is playing out so much in the first 7 chapters of the narrative of Jesus' early life. We'll get into that more later, but I just want to point out those numbers. 12 and 70 are very important numerological things that I can't tell you exactly what they mean, but I can tell you when they show up, they're important. And then the next thing I want to point out is Pithom and Ramses are these 2 cities that they build, and Pithom is the house of Tum, which is one of the sun gods of the land of Egypt, and then Ramses is son of Ra, which is another sun god. I don't know why there are so many sun gods in Egypt.
They had a lot of sun stuff going on.
Very
Okay,
sunny
cool.
country.
I mean,
that's
like,
true. That's true.
when like Nefertiti and Akhenaten were around, like they were worshiping Atun, which is like another sun god.
Okay, cool.
It's a lot, but Ra is closer to like the Jesus of the Egyptian. Like he's more than a sun god.
Yeah, but one of the things that are my main theses that you'll hear much later on as we go through these episodes is that the plagues that happen in Egypt are specifically targeted at some of the Egyptian gods that are being overtaken, particularly Ra, right? Where the 3 days of darkness are meant to say, you have all these gods of the sun, and yet they are not powerful enough to keep you in the light. But we'll get to those later on. I just like to point out that this oppression is overtaken in the midst of that plague. So then we get to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. With Shiprah and Puah, there are a number of different interpretations of who Shiprah and Puah are that are important to dive in here.
I've been waiting to talk about this one, but
Let me also say, I wholeheartedly endorse go and listen to Retelling the Bible. It is one of my favorite episodes on this topic, which is why Scott is here today, because his retelling of this story casts these Hebrew midwives not as Hebrew midwives, but as midwives to the Hebrews. And so, Scott, go ahead and tell us a little bit about your interpretation there.
yeah, that's episode 3.1, The Midwives Who Defy the Gods. Yeah, I really dug into midwifery in ancient Egypt, a topic about which we actually know a great deal. There is one particular ancient papyrus, the Ebers Papyrus, that lays out many of the ancient medical practices of Egypt, and there's all kinds of information about midwifery. So midwifery is this ancient medical art. It's probably older than civilization itself because human women cannot safely, certainly not all the time, give birth without assistance. We know a lot about how it was practiced in Egypt. There are techniques and there are amulets and all kinds of medicines that they used, as well as the prayers. And they are prayers, of course, to Egyptian gods, goddesses mostly, Bes and Hathor, who presided over the birth of human children. And these midwives, they would pray, they would do all of these things. And yeah, as I studied it, I came to the conclusion, I thought that the two midwives probably weren't Hebrews. I know that they're usually claimed as Hebrews in Jewish commentaries. Their names aren't specifically Hebrew. They are kind of vaguely Semitic. So that doesn't necessarily tell us too much. But even if they were Hebrews, if they knew how to be midwives in Egypt, that meant they had the training, which means they would have been training in the temple of Hathor, in the temple of Bes, and they would have followed the Egyptian procedures, and invoking the Egyptian god, that would have been an essential part of the birthing process for them. So whoever they are somewhat apart from the Hebrew women. And you can sort of see that when they talk to the Pharaoh. They speak of the Hebrew women as these animals.
Mm-hmm.
They give birth before we even get there, right? The other thing that I find really fascinating, though, is this. It speaks about how women were attended in birth, and it uses specifically, and it's usually translated in our Bibles as the birth stool. But the Hebrew word there is actually 2 stones. So she is on the 2 stones. Because we know that in ancient Egypt and in ancient Mediterranean world, that's how they would give birth. And the woman, the birthing woman, would stand on 2 bricks or 2 stones that were engraved with images of these gods who presided over the birth. And she would crouch on the stones. And the midwife would be underneath her legs, ready to catch the baby. But as you can imagine, a woman can't just crouch there forever. She would have also been supported on either side, held up by 2 assistants or apprentice midwives who would be physically supporting her as she stood on those stones. And I find it to be this incredible image of women literally supporting a woman going through probably the most dangerous thing she will ever do in her life, give birth, totally surrounded on both sides by two women, another woman in charge attending her. So even if they were totally different, they spoke a different language, different culture, they were absolutely supporting that woman at that moment as she was giving birth. So there's all kinds of wonderful things going on. And this is all taken for granted in the story. So this is the background of the story. So that's my opening comments anyways.
I see this story as an example of power, a power dynamic, as everybody's pretty much been touching on. And while I hate to use binary terms, we often live in a world that forces us into a binary. And the two types of power are sometimes referred to as hard power and soft power, or right-hand power and left-hand power. Right-hand power attacks, kills, and maims. Left-hand power shields and defends. And I got in trouble for saying this in a church one time because they thought I was being political. And I said, well, I should have said, well, if the shoe fits, wear it. Because the reason it's called left-hand power to shield is because in every culture that practices warfare, you cover your left side because that's where your heart is. Your heart, for the 99.9% of the population, is on our left-hand side. And so left-hand power is protective and shielding. That form of power has often been associated with the feminine. The feminine protect, they shield, they care for the young. Right-hand power attacks and kills. And that's what we see Pharaoh doing. Pharaoh, the male in the story. The male power wants to kill. The male power wants to dominate and control and assimilate. They want the male children killed, and so that the Egyptians would make with Hebrew women, thereby assimilating them more into the culture, because it appears they kept their culture intact. Later on, we see that in the story of Moses, where he may have been taught Hebrew culture from his wet nurse, who is his mother. So you have this male dominating power, and it seeks to kill, destroy. It's satanic. It's a satanic power. Whereas the feminine side, these women, whether they were Hebrew or Egyptians or some mix, as was said, of the two, they want to protect and bring life. And so it's that feminine power that we see really at work in the story. It's really a feminist telling of the story. And that is the power we should embrace, because they fear God. They fear God, they respect, they revere God, because God wants to protect, God wants to shape and comfort, which is totally different from the way many of us are taught to view godly power. And that's because we're taught to see God as a male, as one who attacks, kills, and destroys. Basically, we're taught to see God as Satan.
Ooh,
Hey, don't
preach,
don't get so Gnostic in here.
That's Elle's job.
Hey, former Pentecostal preacher, I'm good with Gnosticism. I mean, come on. Micah's got more Gnosticism in him than he realizes.
I know, and that's
frustrating
part.
I'm a former evangelical. I have lots of Gnosticism to get over. But
this is where it's different from Gnosticism. Gnosticism says, at least ancient Gnosticism says, this is the way it is. What I'm saying is, it's not the way it is, it's the way we view it, and we've been taught to view it. It's actually, to paraphrase Walter Wink, it is the lie that the demonic powers of the world have been trying to get us to believe since the beginning of creation. The demonic powers of the world want us to view things from power and control. That's why Satan means tempter, deceiver. It's all about power and control. To touch on the Jesus story, which parallels the Moses story, the Jesus in the wilderness, as he's journeying through the wilderness, is tempted with power and control. That's something right here. We're recording this in the season of Lent, which is a journey into the wilderness, 40 days in the wilderness, where we're tempted with power and control. And sadly, in politics, that's what the left and the right want to do. They think the best way is if we have power, we will be in control. But the Jesus narrative, to bring it in from a Christian perspective, is the only way to get power is to give it away. And I've said this before, I'll always say it, the Red Hot Chili Peppers have the best theology. Give it away, give it away, give it away. And that is the only way we can enter into power in a godly way, is to give it up. So it's the lie of the demonic powers that this is the way it's always been. Whereas we look back at Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, we see a God who wants to protect, who wants to cover, who wants to be there for the people in the garden. The antithesis of that is when we begin to grasp and seek power for ourselves.
Elle?
Now that the men are done talking,
Yeah, about time.
maybe my perspective is a little bit flippant, but I did take an anthropology of pregnancy and birth going through school, and if anyone ever has an opportunity to take that kind of class, I highly recommend it. But it doesn't matter in my reading whether or not these midwives are Hebrew, Egyptian, Israelite. It doesn't matter, because midwives, their role in society is the closest thing to actually like being in control of life and death.
Mm.
They were the prenatal care of the world up until doctors decided to stick their unwashed hands into ladies' birthing canals.
This is referencing an actual historical occurrence. This is not just Elle deriding men. It's, yeah.
No, I'm like doctors would go from, autopsies to birthing babies, and that
Not a drop of water between.
not a lick of soap.
Yep.
Anyways, it really doesn't surprise me, even if they were Egyptian, that midwives whose job it is to make sure women stay alive and babies stay alive through birth, which is one of the most dangerous acts a person can do because of the stupid way our anatomy is. Like, if they're told to kill babies, their job is to refuse, because their job to midwifery is much more aligned to like what God wants than what this arbitrary king wanted.
Yeah.
Like, the vibe is truly like the solidarity among women, among a subjugated class, whether or not they're enslaved or not. And I do think this is a very great example of sabotage in action.
Mm.
In terms of the way unions say sabotage. Pharaoh has no earthly idea how childbirth actually works. So when they tell him to buy into the stereotype that, oh, these Hebrew women, they're just animals, they pop them out by the time we're there. They just go out in the field, bay, and like slides out. He like that. If anybody who's been around a childbirth knows that's not true, but because it's a realm of the women and he's not privy to that, there's power in their knowledge above his. They're really lying to their boss, and it protects people, and that's always okay.
I love that this really starts a theme. I mean, it was started earlier with the fact that no king seemed to be able to tell the difference between a sister and a wife. But like it really plays into this theme that is constant throughout the Bible, that kings are just dumb as fuck. Just rock solid heads. Like, they don't know anything. And the two exceptions are King David, and that's because King David used to be a shepherd before he became a king. And then King Solomon, specifically because he begged God to make him smart enough to do this. And every other king is just a dumbass, with the other exception of Josiah, because he listened to the people who were writing down the book. And so, but every other king is idiotic, doesn't understand how things actually work. And that common theme is why power doesn't actually work effectively throughout the Old Testament, and plays into what Derek was just saying, that the structure of power is the problem itself. The other thing that I love here, as I was reading through some of the commentaries, are that Shiphrah just means beautiful and Puah just means lass or little girl. And these names are less names as much as like titles, like job titles. And so the idea that Shiphrah and Puah might just be talking about all the midwives, not just these two particular, but that they're actually stand-ins for the whole class of midwives. Because the Hebrew people at this time, there are several 100,000 of them. Can you imagine with several 100,000 people there being 2 doctors to deliver every baby? I don't imagine that would be the case. And so there have to be many more than these. And so Shiphrah and Puah, rather than being individual people, are actually stand-ins for the class of people. And I love that, because that is, again, reinforcing what Elle just said. It is class solidarity. It is all of these people coming together and saying, no, we're finding a way to subvert this command, not just as 2 individuals, but through the entirety of the society. They all said, no, this is unjust. I know this is our job, but we're not just going to do our job, right? There are so many atrocities that happen just because people say, I was just doing my job. And these women refuse to just do their job. They instead choose to do what is right.
And I know that we're going for more of the symbolic existence of these ladies, but what does lead me towards maybe they weren't Hebrew, maybe they weren't Israelite, is that because the midwives respected God, God gave them households of their own. To me, the respect is in the action of protecting these women and children, which feels more like, they didn't have a specific command, but they were just falling in line, whether or not that was their national allegiance or ethnic allegiance.
Well, I think, that word respect, I do take it, L, to be the same way. It's it's not that they know who the God of the Hebrews are, but they respect life. They respect the existence of the Hebrew people. They respect that this culture deserves to exist inherently, and thus respect God, because this is illustrative of the fact that even here in the Old Testament, long before the commandments to love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, or love your neighbor as yourself, are articulated as the 2 greatest commandments, here it is being said that is the same thing. Loving God is loving your neighbor, and so you are respecting God by loving your neighbor in this important way.
Yeah, I just looked up my story. I saw Puah and Shiphrah. Well, they're too old by the time the Exodus finally comes, but their children are raised among the slave folks. They join them, and they take the knowledge of the midwives of Egypt into the promised land. Can I just say a little bit more? I've loved all the comments about the power that these women have. And Pharaoh has an apparent power, but this left-handed feminine power of the women, and specifically the midwives who have this knowledge, is so powerful. And it is largely about the knowledge, and very specifically. And I think that the Pharaoh is made a buffoon intentionally. They use their knowledge and count on Pharaoh's ignorance of the whole process of childbirth. He has no idea what happens on the birth stool, very clearly, if he at all believes the things that they're saying. He certainly has no knowledge, as Elle said, of what a midwife is. If he thinks that they can stand there and support a woman through possibly hours of labor, helping her every step of the way, and then take her baby and kill it, he has no idea what they do, very clearly. So they have knowledge that is totally alien to him, and they use that to manipulate him. There is power in knowledge.
One of the things Scott brought up when I was diving into this, that Scott mentioned, I came across as well, is how midwifery in the ancient Near East was very religious, in the sense that they had religious rituals that they incorporated into it. They incorporated prayers, incantations, and sacred rituals. So they were a part of the religious establishment, which Pharaoh is not going to bust up against, because his very position is tied in with the religion of his people. And one of the things I know all you leftists will love in this is that I found reference that there may have been a midwifery guild. And so what Elle said is that they're representative of these people. They are representatives of the midwifery guild. And so they had power, and they knew that. So I love that idea, because when you look into ancient Near Eastern religions, there were always these mystery cults that were going around. And if you weren't allowed into that group, you didn't know their sacred rituals. So Pharaoh was truly ignorant of this, because he would not, as a man, have been allowed into that feminine space. And that is part of the beauty of it, is, look, I don't know what's going on, which Elle brought this up as well. And I really appreciate that. That's where a lot of the problems came up, is when we allow men into this space. That was a problem, because they forced the midwives out. In what was it, at 16, 1700s, when men started really getting involved in that, and they wanted to force the midwives out so they could have the power to control it. And suddenly, we're in a country now in America where more and more men are trying to control the reproductive rights of women, in which, I am not female. I'm not identifying that way, but I have a daughter who's in her mid-20s who's scared about this. My wife and I have had conversations about this. And we are in a place where we're seeing men try to grasp power that they should not be grasping. They're trying to enter into something, and they're trying to control who is born and who isn't. I mean, look at what went on in Alabama with IVF, in one end, they're trying to say, and I'm really close to Alabama. In one way, they're trying to say, okay, we're going to force you to have babies unless you actually want a baby. How crazy is that? But that's what we can see in this story going on right now.
Absolutely. It brings to mind for me a lot of the more recent contrast with women supporting women through the Jane Collective and other attempts to get access to abortion and to reproductive rights. That these are all carrying in this tradition of helping save women's lives through a process that can be extremely deadly, through a process that can eliminate families because they are not able to have the rights that they need to have. And instead of allowing women to have that autonomy, instead of allowing women to make those decisions for themselves, instead of allowing women as a collective this power to be able to defy Pharaoh and be able to have control over their own lives and lead to their own liberation, instead we have the same sort of system trying to ensure that it is ultimately the people in power who determine who gets to live and who gets to die, who gets to have access to children, and who gets to control access to children. Because we all know that if Trump's kid or Trump's girlfriends wanted to have an abortion, it would never be a problem for him.
Abortion for me, not for thee. Duh.
Yes, exactly.
I'm sorry. I just, as soon as men got more involved in birth, suddenly women had to lie on their backs for birth instead of being in the natural crouchy position supported by other people, which led to a lot fewer fistulas and things that could cause life-threatening issues during the birthing process.
Well, see, Sorry, I didn't even think about it that way because I've been present for two births. I've seen it happen, and I couldn't imagine trying to give birth standing up. But also,
It
like,
is much harder to push to have the canal be opened up in the right angle. Like when you're on your back, and also if you're having an epidural, you can't feel everything in the right way. Not that, like, if you need an epidural, no judgment, like, no judgment. You can still have those and squat.
yeah.
Also, no judgment if you laid on your back, no judgment. Like,
Yeah.
but it has only been recently that in hospitals, they'll let you be crouched and squatted. Like, it is a much more comfortable position to give birth than laying on your back, which, like, if you think gravity helps, gravity helps things go out. The way that midwives have been, like, really pushed outside of the medical system starting in the 30s, 40s, but then in the 50s and 60s, where you have very medicalized births become popular. There was something called, like, a twilight sleep, which, like, you drugged the fuck out of the mother and she had to be put into a straitjacket because she was basically insane during the birth giving process and would, like, claw herself, nurses, everybody. But she didn't remember any of the pain, so it was great because the doctors were like, good job, boys. No problems here. Let's put her on some barbiturates and send her home.
I'm sure that didn't create a generation of emotionally distant children that would then grow up to think that all kinds of abuse are totally normal and that they could accumulate all the wealth and not give any of it to us.
I know it said, like, way earlier, but the religious aspect of birth that was present in ancient Egypt was present in most cultures up until men got involved with the child birthing process. Like, throughout human history, the mystical, magical, religious aspect was present and controlled by women up until men got involved with the process. So...
Yeah. Well, I have to say that 693 Kyrie eleisons brought my son into the world, so there's definitely still prayer happening, and lots of rituals and incantations happening in the birthing process. So it was 7 shy of 700. So,
well, if we want to be very honest about birth and the way it is in our culture, I remember when my son came into this world and how the nurses, and I think it's because of the male influence of some doctors, is how the nurses didn't take my wife's pain seriously because he was coming in sideways and they weren't allowed to take my wife's pain seriously. That was kind of what they said was everybody has pain. I remember them saying that everybody hurts, what are you complaining about? This is normal. This is natural. And then when the physician did come in, we had to find out that was not true, that our son was coming in sideways. And so my wife had to have an emergency C-section. And that's because we don't take women's pain seriously.
Yeah, Ephemeral and I were actually talking, like, a little bit about that before all of y'all came in. And my mistrust with men in the medical system, not that lady doctors can't do that too, but systematically there's a problem with not taking women's pain seriously. And women haven't been studied like the male body has in modern medical science. So there's still stuff that's like, whoa, what a surprise. The female body.
I could go into that whole thing about what level is your pain at? That's just ridiculous. What if you live at 6? Some people have chronic illnesses where they live at a pain level of 6. And so you come in and you say, oh, I'm at a 9. They don't take you seriously because you're constantly in pain. Those are problems with our medical system because we're taught to not listen to the patient because they don't know what's going on with their own body. And women of color even they have it worse. I mean, they've done studies on that. They don't take a woman of color's pain as seriously as they do a woman who may appear to be white. It's just insane.
Yeah, and it feeds into the racism and the animalistic nature that they were already ascribing, right? That here you can hear Pharaoh describing them like animals, right? Who are going to breed and they're going to get out of hand, and then we're going to have all these feral stray dogs running around, and that's going to be a huge problem, right? Which ties back to Elle's earlier point, is the same way that we talk about immigrants and the same way that we talk about people who don't have their documentation. We describe them as animals, right? As we are talking about what's happening on the border, or we dehumanize them and we de-emphasize them. We literally put them in a structure that looks more like a pound than like something that a human being should be living in, that didn't even have a toilet.
And we only want to accept immigrants in our country that are assimilated. I was listening to two comedians talking a while back. It may have been on the Daily Show, and they were talking about, or another show, how they had to get their visa and they have to be exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
When exceptional means you have to basically be like an upper middle class white person. And so they have to renew that. One of them was John Oliver, and I forget who the other one was. And they were just talking back and forth about this. And that's assimilation at its heart. That's what we want to do. I remember many years ago, I read this article, which really changed my way of thinking. When I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s, we like to talk about how America is a melting pot. Well, the idea of a melting pot is assimilation. And in the article, it was talking about that. It's about everybody being the same, where America should be more like a salad with all types of different wonderful things put in it. And everything has its own flavor. Everything has its own taste. But that's what Pharaoh's wanting. He's wanting them to be assimilated as Egyptians. Going back to what I said earlier about doing away with the boys so that, hopefully you'll raise, if an Egyptian marries a Hebrew woman, raise the children as good Egyptians. And I think that's one of the powerful things about the story, is it wants to indicate that the Hebrew people, in spite of all of this, were able to maintain their own identity, which is a beautiful part of the story.
And the rabbis say that this is why Judaism is matrilineal, right? It goes through the mother, because even if they try to eliminate all the men, then women are still able to resist assimilation. They're still able to be Jewish, and the children that they have will still be Jewish, because if someone tries this again, right? And that's the reason given. Of course, there are other sociological factors as to why Judaism is matrilineal rather than patrilineal, but this story is at least the reason that is often given. And as you're saying, the melting pot, what really America is a melting pot is white supremacy is a melting pot, right? I had a great-grandfather who was fresh off the boat from Scotland, and the extent of my connection with Scottish culture before I married a Scot was that my uncle's names sound Scottish. That's it. And my grandmother came up to me at the wedding and said, "Why aren't you in a Stuart tartan?" And I said, "Well, why would I wear a Stuart tartan?" And she said, "Because your grandfather was a fresh off the boat Stuart." But I had no connection to that. I didn't even know he was Scottish, right? Because my culture was so eliminated from me. And so now I'm raising two kids that are half American and half Scottish, and I'm desperately trying to find ways to help them stay connected with their culture, because white supremacy was the taking of all of these different people groups and saying, you can belong inside our in-group only if you give up everything that makes you different. And so at first there was, the WASPs here in North America, and you were only white if you were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And then the Irish and the Germans started coming over, and they said, well, you can be white too, but only if you assimilate into the system of power and use your power to to oppress the people below you, and, you know, stop talking in German and in Gaelic and start speaking in English. And, you know, I guess you can stay Catholic, but only if you become super conservative on these issues. And so, like, all of these things are a slow assimilation into the same sort of whiteness that replaces the individual ethnic identities from these countries that when you go back over to the UK or go back over to Europe and an American goes over and says, look, I'm Irish, everyone makes fun of you because you don't have any connection to the culture. All that you know is that you're there to kiss the Blarney Stone that Irish people piss on because because Americans keep going over to kiss it without having any connection to it. And so, you know, that cultural erasure is something that America has done extremely effectively. And the current systems in which we live is what happens when Pharaoh wins.
And that American system of assimilation is so close to this Roman system of assimilation.
Yeah.
Curious. You know, Romans had a little touch more of the salad going on. They'd be like, oh, you like ISIS? All right, you can hang out at this ISIS place, but you gotta fight for Rome. You gotta be Rome. You have to be the Roman you wish to be, like you wish to achieve. And, you know, a place was conquered, and to become a full citizen, to have good rights, to not be subjugated, you had to become Roman, which is the same process of like, well, you want the good things in life in America, you gotta be a white American. Mm-hmm. And over time, that like whiteness there's still obviously white supremacy in America, but that's cast off if you have enough money, which that was also true for the Roman system of assimilation. You got enough money, do what you want. We love you. We love the money. Yay, Rome. And our founding fathers were legionnaires who wanted to fully base our system of government off of mostly ancient Rome. They did also like ancient Greece a lot too, but that's because the Romans liked ancient Greece.
Well, friends, thank you all so much for being a part of this podcast. We so appreciate you, Derek and Elle and Scott. Thank you all so much for being a part of this. And you, dear listener, for being a part of this and joining us in our second season. It is just absolutely phenomenal that we have made it this far. I never thought we would, and yet now here we are, starting our second season, exploring the Bible together in all of these wonderful ways. I hope that you will be with us for the rest of the Bible and only expand the number of people who are part of this wonderful community. Now, past Micah, say the profound shit. And thank you, future Micah. The Word in Black and Red is a ministry of the Lamapak Alternative Church, a home for everyone left on the outside. Your contributions help this working-class project invest in better tools and spend time organizing, recording, and editing this podcast. And hey, if you support this 16-year project, we might even get it done this decade. We use Patreon for now, but keep an eye out for when we switch to a more ethical way of supporting the show. You can join in the life of our community in our wonderful Discord, where you can chat with the folks you've heard this episode, find links to purchase our merch, and participate in a spiritual community for everyone seeking to build the kingdom of God. We're also a fun follow on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr, and Reddit. You can find the Discord, Patreon, and all the other ways to connect with us and these wonderful co-hosts in the show notes. Now, future Micah, say the profound shit. And thank you, past Micah. Now go into the world where you have duties and responsibilities and things that you are told to do, and find the way that you can use the little power you have to resist the evils, and instead bring life where there was meant to be death, so that maybe one day you could be called Shiprah and Puah too. Shalom.